Today in round 5 of the European Club Cup, I played an incredibly exciting, instructive and also very long game, more than 5 hours. A lot of things were happening, so I would like to show you all the ins and outs of this real chess fight. I'm playing with the black pieces against international master from Sweden, Kaan Küçüksarı. He's only 21 years old, very talented player. And I'm playing with black. Tough game, second black game in a row. It's always very tough, especially when you're playing again against a very strong opponent. Anyway, I'm playing with black as said, and my opponent opens the game here with 1d4. I go knight f6, c4, g6, g3 again, bishop g7, bishop g2. This is actually what I had also in my game yesterday. There I played the move c5. I decided to play a bit different now. I castled here, and after knight c3, now I play the move c5. Big difference with the game from yesterday is that I could play queen a5 with check very shortly after c5. My opponent plays the principled move. He goes for d5. So after d6, knight f3, e6, castling kingside, take on d5. We have the main line of the Benoni opening. Very popular opening, used to be played by many strong players over the years. And I decided here to try a bit of a sideline with the move knight a6. Now the knight is not badly placed at all. Very often it will come to c7 in order to prepare the expansion on the queen side with the move b5. That's the main idea. My opponent went for e4, occupying the center. I play bishop g4. He played h3. And after bishop takes, we have interesting position now, as we have two big imbalances in the structure. First of all, white is having the bishop pair, but the position is relatively closed. There are no open files, no open diagonals. I do have two knights, and well, there are a lot of plans here. I have always ideas to go knight d7, to control the e5 square, to open up the diagonal for the bishop. So there's definitely something to play for. Now, I had to think here. I really want to get in the move b5, so that later on I can chase the knight away from c3. I think I was a bit too obsessed with that plan. I may have considered, instead of playing the move queen d7, the move c4, which is also a very thematical idea in these structures, as there's an alternative plan of getting that knight into the game from c5, may hit the pawn on e4, can jump into d3, so that's a very interesting alternative. I played queen d7, I'm attacking the pawn on h3, but my opponent ignores that by playing the move bishop f4, because if I do take on h3, there's bishop takes d6, and white now is having an overwhelming advantage with these central pawns. So instead of taking, I played here the move b5. That was my second idea. My opponent plays interesting move a4, putting pressure on the queen side. I advance the pawn to b4 to hit the knight. And here, very interesting moment, as my opponent played now the move knight b5, attacking that pawn on d6. And I have to do something about it. I played here knight e8, which on one hand is not ideal. I'm defending the pawn. I'm also hitting that pawn on b2. So my opponent went for queen e2 to defend the pawn. But look, that queen is also eyeing that knight on a6. So there are possible ideas like knight takes d6, trying to win material. Here I played knight a2 c7, as I'm intending here to trade off that knight on b5. And well, in general, if knights are getting swapped, I can take back with the queen or even with the knight. Maybe I have ideas to get in c4. I'm hoping that I'm fast enough to generate some play on the queen side in combination with that beautiful bishop. For now, I don't really see how white is going to use the bishop pair. Now things are getting extremely interesting, as my opponent opens up the center here with the move e5. I take on e5, taking the bishop. He takes back. Everything gets swapped now. Bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes b5. Pawn takes b5, and now still everything is hanging, but there's also still a knight on e8, which is not looking too great. First of all, if you do take, for instance, the pawn on b5, I didn't like that because of d6. I'm a pawn up, the rook is under threat, but look at that knight. It feels very wrong to play in a materialistic way. What I should have done, and that's also the move I looked at, is knight d6. The knight is an ideal blockader. That's what I'm teaching my students. Why I didn't play it was for very concrete reasons. I saw some ghosts. I was afraid of this move, rook a6, when white is going to challenge that blockade. I calculated this line, knight takes pawn. And now there is this move d6 once again, attacking the rook. And I looked at this, rook a8. But then I thought, well, there is bishop c6 and white is going to win material. However, I missed that I can take with the queen on d6, which is in fact a very logical move. The big thing I missed here is that after queen takes d6, I can actually take back with a knight. And black is absolutely fine. Anyway, because I missed it, I went for a different solution. I played queen d6. Of course, I'm hoping queens are coming off the board, and then the knight is a fantastic blockading piece. It's stopping the passed pawn. It hits the pawn on b5, and it can also support the march of the c pawn. My opponent, understandably, keeps queens on the board. I go knight c7, so I'm threatening these pawns. He cannot go rook a6, very important detail. Knight is covering that square, but the line continues with rook fc1. He's hitting my pawn on c5. And now again, I missed another very important detail. I have a problem defending the pawn on c5. I don't have good pieces for that. I decided to take on b5 here with the knight. However, much stronger move is rook fe8, attacking the queen. And then he cannot take the pawn on c5 because of rook e1. That is actually not so difficult. That's something I should have seen. Of course, he cannot take the rook because of queen takes c5. And otherwise, if he moves the king, I take on c5 the queen, and then the rook on a1 will be taken. So, missed opportunity to equalize instantly. I decided to take on b5. But now after queen takes c5, queen takes, rook takes, well, we have this endgame in which white has a passed pawn and also the somewhat more active pieces. Now the position gets more open. We will see the battle of bishop versus knight. I have to play very actively. This is what I calculated. I went for knight d4, attacking the bishop, threatening knight b3, hitting both rooks. So the bishop got to go back to d1. And I play rook ac8. I want to exchange one pair of rooks. And look, if he goes for that exchange and then takes the pawn on a7, he's actually not winning a pawn. There's rook c1 and the bishop is badly placed on d1. Therefore, my opponent went for rook to a5. And I played rook fd8. So that if he takes on a7, I take the pawn on d5. Black is absolutely alright in that case. But my opponent played a much better move. Bishop a4. So there are ideas to get the rook into the game with the rook d1. I played rook c7, defending the pawn. Rook d1, attacking the knight. I played knight f5. The knight is back on its way to d6 if needed, to blockade the pawn. Rook b5, hitting the pawn on b4. Rook c4, defending it. But now the other pawn on a7 is under an attack. I could push the pawn either to a6 or a5, but I decided to aim for simplifications with the move rook d4. So that I'm intending to trade off one pair of rooks once again, which is what happened. He takes the pawn on a7, I take the pawn on d5. But things are not completely equal, because here rook b7, and I have a problem holding my pawn on b4. And I said, well, no problem. I give away that pawn. I play the move b3, which is an excellent move. I don't mind giving up a pawn if the bishop is going to be exchanged, because I think this endgame, it's still a lot of work to be done, but once white is going to push the pawn, I can get behind. Should be a theoretical draw. My opponent felt like, okay, there's no rush, no need to rush here. The pawn on b3 can be taken anytime. He's thinking about a plan like bishop e8 to hit the pawn on f7, but there's still rook f5. So instead of playing that move right away, he played g4 to take away the f5 square from the rook. Therefore, I need to prevent that bishop coming to e8. I played king f8. Good move. I had only like half a minute left to reach move 40, 6 more moves to go. So it was really, really tense at this point, but I think black is defending quite well here. King g2, and being on the defensive side here, as a rule of thumb, it's very important to trade off as many pawns as possible. So I played h5, king g3 played, pawn takes g4. He he takes back. And now another interesting move. There's more than one good move here for black, but I am aiming for simplifications with the move f5. Ready to trade off again one pair of pawns. Bishop takes b3. Now, finally, he is taking the pawn. And I take on g4, king takes g4. We have this endgame of 2 pawns versus 1 pawn, but I felt really confident. It should be a draw. Very important now that I don't allow my opponent to cut off the black king. So I played king f7, rook b7 check, king f6, rook b6, king g7. So he has improved the rook. But what should white do? There's almost no possibility of breaking through on the king side. So he decides to go with his king to the other side. Ideally he wants to support that b pawn. But once he does that, well, I'm gonna hit the pawn on f2, which is what happens. I give a check, king e3, rook e5, king d2. Now I go back. I hit a pawn. He got to go back with the king. I keep giving checks. He is hiding here with the king on f1. And I play rook c5. So whenever he is going to push the pawn, I can quickly go rook c2, rook b2. Behind the passed pawn is a rule of thumb in these endgames. Very important to know that technique. More about that technique in this game as well. Let's have a look. My opponent played here rook e6. So he wants to defend the pawn from the side, so that the rook is defending both pawns. I go rook b5, forcing the rook to go there. And now the plan is very simple. If white has all the time in the world, he will bring up the king and then push the pawn, and the rook ensures that there's no counterplay for black on the king side. So I have to act very quickly now. King f6, king e1, king f5. Activation of the king also super important. King d1 and king f4. King c2, and here I was spending once again a bit more time. We got this additional half an hour a few moves ago, so I was calculating here. There's one very instructive idea, because I mentioned that you would like to trade off as many pawns as possible. However, if I play here this move, king f3, he will go rook e6, attacking the pawn, and now I should definitely not take the pawn on f2, because after rook takes g6 and then trying to come back with the king, here the technique is to cut off the king along the rank, along the 4th rank, ensuring that the black king cannot come back. White has a very nice plan here to convert this advantage. Look at this. I want to show you it. It all didn't happen in the game. It's very important for your endgame understanding. Rook b8, rook c4. Rook is fantastically placed here, guarding the king, cutting off the black king along the 4th rank as well. And white has a simple plan to move up the b pawn, then bring the king, and after black is making waiting moves, you can move your rook to the 5th rank. And if the king comes closer, you play b5, and here anytime the same procedure, king c4, rook c6, b6, etc. There's nothing you can defend against it. So I should not trade off the pawn on f2, and therefore I played here the move g5 immediately. Rook e3, so controlling the 3rd rank, g4, and b3. I go rook b8, waiting move. And look, if he's going to bring up his king, I can give a bunch of checks. And even if the king is going too far away, there are always ideas to hit the pawn on f2 on a good day. So the king cannot really become active here. Went back to the king side. Rook a8. So here I'm about to give a check. The rook is switching position now. King e2, rook a2, king f1, and the rook is here again behind, controlling both white's pawns. King g2, rook b1, rook c3, rook b2, waiting moves, rook check, king g5. Now, of course, king g3 runs into rook takes b3. If you do push the pawn, well, it's actually a very simple draw. There's rook b3, cutting off the king, and white's king is boxed in, cannot really become active. There's always the plan of going back with the rook to b2 and hit the pawn on f2. So my opponent played here rook b4, rook b1, so that after king g3, very important, I'm in time to give a rook g1 check. And the white pieces, they don't have time to collect that pawn on g4. So rook b8 played. Now things are getting interesting once again. King f4, rook b5, king e4 played. Now this is okay. If you go king g3, I give check. King h4, rook g2, and I can pick up the pawn on f2. and then get behind, and the king is very close anyway. So my opponent went rook b7, king f4, rook b8. He tries to create some sort of zugzwang, but it's not real zugzwang, so we just go back and forth. And now finally he's pushing that b pawn. This is where things are getting interesting now. I played rook b3, cutting off the king, and he goes b5. And here you have to be very alert, because with the pawn on b7, white would actually be winning. Because the plan is to give a check with the rook on g8 and then promote the b pawn. Therefore, my king should be on one of these two squares, so that there's no good check of the white rook. King g6, b6, king g7. Excellent defensive technique. Rook b7, king g6, rook b8, king g7 once again. And well, things are looking absolutely fine. Now my opponent played here the move b7, because there's basically no way to make progress. Even if you try to run with your king now, I put a rook on the second rank, I can make waiting moves with my king. And if he goes king d1, I have time to take the pawn on f2, because the pawn is not threatening to promote. If he pushes now, I'm back in time with rook b2, controlling the pawn from behind. So therefore, my opponent sooner or later has to put the pawn on b7. But I'm very happy with that development. However, you have to be very careful, and here comes very important endgame technique. You cannot walk with your king into this direction. If you go king f7, look at this beautiful trick. There is a rook h8, setting up a skewer, and you're threatening to promote the pawn. If you take on b7, it's rook h7, and the rook will be gone. So that's not good. Instead, king h7 is the right square. These two squares are very important, as white has no chance to activate as a rook. King f1, rook b2, king g1, king g7, king g2. So here again he's attempting to go king g3. Even that is not such a big problem. But anyway, it's nice technique to cut off the king. King b1, king f1, sorry. Rook b2, king e1, king h7, king d1. Don't take on f2 the pawn. Don't be too greedy. There is rook c8 and the pawn promotes. So just be patient, king g7. Now finally that king will become active, but we will see that there is not much the king can actually do. King e5, king g7. If the king goes to the f-file, you can always take on f2 with check. Look at this, king e6, rook e2. Again, if you go king f5, you can take here. And this is a theoretical draw. Like in the game, I will show you what happened. The pawns on f2 and g4 stayed on the board. My opponent went for king d5, rook d2. And well, after king e4, we agreed to a draw. This is very important elementary endgame stuff. Basically, this is what you have to know starting out learning rook endgames. The trick is that the king cannot support the march of the passed pawn. If you play king c6, then don't go behind the passed pawn, because here, with the king protecting the pawn on b7, well, there is rook c8, king defense, and next you can go for the move b8 queen, and you're winning the rook. The technique here is that once the king defends the pawn on b7, you can play here rook c2. You can just give a bunch of checks, king b6, rook b2, and so on. If the king goes back somewhere, just make sure the rook is behind the pawn, and it's a technical draw. Therefore, after the move king e4 in the game, we agreed to a draw after 5 hours of play. Very tense game. I mean, to be honest, I felt under pressure, but once the bishop for the knight was exchanged, I felt actually quite relieved and confident that I should be able to hold it. However, being a pawn down, you have to be very alert all the time. You don't want to make a mistake. You get tired towards the end of the game. It's already quite a long tournament. 5 very intense rounds have been played so far. I'm not too unhappy with my score. 2 out of 5 playing very strong opposition. 2 strong grandmasters and 2 IMs. 1 FIDE master. So yeah, altogether it's okay. I will just keep fighting, and hopefully tomorrow another interesting game to cover. Thanks for watching, and if you do like this video, you know what to do. Thanks for your support, guys, and I will see you soon again.